Hello everyone, our topic this week was requested by all of these lovely people. We'll be going over the 7 deadly sins from Darksiders 3. Also, as the sins are the main antagonists of the game, this video is obviously full of massive spoilers for Darksiders 3. You've been warned.
So, first things first. In the Darksiders universe, the 7 deadly sins are actual personifications of the very sins their names describe. And by all appearances, they are truly immortal, or at least something close to it. They can die when their bodies are broken beyond usability. However, given enough time, the sins will either form a new body, or their current body will regenerate. We don't really know which. We actually see this in the case of Wrath, who Fury presumably kills early on in the game, as evidenced by all of his flames cooling as he falls prone after having a blade buried in his face, only to be seen walking around healthy and destructive much later in the game. Based upon comments made by Fury when dealing with Gluttony, the eventual reveal of Envy, as well as the description of Avarice on the Darksiders website, we also know that the 7 deadly sins have some degree of shapeshifting ability. Whether they can shift forms at will, or the shapeshifting is usually more time or effort intensive, is unknown. Though the one time we see it on screen with Envy near the end of the game seems to indicate that it can happen pretty quickly. Beyond these core traits, however, their abilities appear to vary wildly. As they cannot be permanently slain, the Charred Council and the Horsemen instead relied upon the tried and true method for handling immortal enemies: imprisonment. How the sins were imprisoned prior to the game is unknown, but after they are freed at the treacherous hand of the Charred Council, Fury captures them all once again using an artifact known as the Talisman of Sin, an object evidently capable of holding the souls of the 7 deadly sins, which we'll cover in more detail later.
So first up, let's talk about Avarice. As the embodiment of greed, it may come as little surprise that Avarice is encountered within his treasure room, an entire wing of a museum that he has claimed for his own, piled high with all of his acquired treasures. Many would consider this particular incarnation of greed's sense of treasure as suspect, however, as in his case, treasure seems to be just about anything that strikes his fancy, from classically recognized valuables such as money and coin, all the way down to gear cogs and refrigerators. Though a fridge that size probably wouldn't have been cheap pre-apocalypse, so maybe we need to reevaluate our conceptions of value. Avarice takes the form of what basically looks like the ultimate treasure goblin, which is oddly appropriate considering the upcoming Darksiders Genesis game. He also possesses superhuman strength and speed, as evidenced by the fact that he throws large objects around with ease, makes 20 or so foot jumps with similar levels of ease, and carries a truly massive, we're talking like half again his body size, bag of treasure on his back. Treasure which even includes bodies. Bodies may seem an odd trophy at first glance, but when one considers that first, the Children of Avarice enemy units are the corpses of children animated by Avarice to guard his treasure hoard, and second, that Avarice's first reaction upon finding Fury in his treasure room is to decide that she should stay there, as a permanent addition to his collection. I mean, it's still weird, but at least he's consistent.
Next, let's discuss lust. Lust is a standout sin in the game due to their uniqueness in the grand spectrum of lustful representation. Lust is, in various media, almost always portrayed as a sensual, beautiful woman, or much more rarely, an intoxicating and handsome man. Darksiders takes a different but immediately sensible direction with this character, instead choosing to make Lust a distinctly genderless character. Lust is a tall, like twice as tall as Fury tall, character that has a vaguely feminine design, albeit a distinctly muscular one, leaving their depiction in that rare, well-executed androgynous space that will have some saying Lust looks like a feminine character, while others will say that they look like a masculine character. Adding to the intentional confusion and well-thought-out design is the fact that Lust's voice sounds distinctly feminine, but is actually played by a male voice actor. Lust's usual preoccupation with sex and carnal pleasures is also kicked to the curb, along with those more common depictions of the character. In Darksiders, Lust is one of those master manipulator archetypes. They delight in looking into the heart and soul of their prey and offering what they most want, most desire, that thing that they most lust for. In fact, as part of Lust's boss fight, they convince an Archangel to fight by their side against Fury, making it a 2-on-1 affair with Fury against 2 moderately powerful melee combatants. This skill for peering into the deepest desires of their foes is aided by Lust's ability to create illusions, crafting convincing visions and scenarios to lure their prey into joining them, or at least following Lust's will. Lust also appears to be able to either teleport or move at extreme speeds, though these apparent effects could in fact be extensions of their powers of illusion. Additionally, Lust is a highly skilled swordsperson. We would in fact argue that their technique is probably better than any of the other sins, though their overall combat prowess is likely second to that of Wrath. Finally, though it doesn't play a role in the combat, the Charred Council granted Lust the ability to raise the dead to act in their service, a new power that surprises Fury when she first comes across Lust.
Next up, let's discuss Sloth. Sloth takes the form of a giant insectoid creature, wielding a staff of some kind, and thoroughly lives up to his name. He's probably the most perfect sloth we've ever encountered in any media, bantering with Fury upon arrival in an attempt to simply avoid the fight because, frankly, he has neither the interest nor the energy to pursue combat with the horsemen. His odds of winning or losing aren't even part of the calculation. He would simply rather do nothing than fight. He's so lazy that when the combat begins, instead of moving on his own, he allows his minions to carry his throne around for mobility. As an added indicator of how laziness dominates his life, that very throne is formed of his own hardened, uncleaned, unremoved excrement. Even as he fights, he complains about having to move, and when defeated, asks Fury whether she's tired or not and whether this whole balance thing is really even worth the effort. To his credit, though, Sloth is also, based upon the events of the game, and despite criticism that Fury gets from the fanbase, the only deadly sin that could have defeated Fury on his own. During their pre-battle banter, Sloth literally lulls Fury into a malaise, and his minions start carting her off to heaven knows where. It's only the interference of Fury's Watcher, goading the horseman into wakefulness, that rouses her from her slumber.
Which means that the next sin we need to talk about is Wrath. Why? Because many will point out in response to our assertion that Sloth did the best against Fury, that Wrath actually beat her in the first go-round, and to that we say, well, yeah, kinda. Wrath is depicted as a large, almost as wide as he is tall, heavily armored, dual-blade-wielding warrior covered in flames beneath his armor. Like most depictions of Wrath, he is a comparatively dense character with tremendous lust and skill for battle, as well as the ability to wreath his attacks in flames, even generating flaming shockwaves. Less commonly, Wrath can invoke anger or heighten the pre-existing anger of those in his vicinity. What's more, he literally feeds off of this anger. In their second fight, Wrath will periodically break off to beat other combatants to death and heal based upon the energy he absorbed from that fight. When first encountered, Fury and Wrath duel to a comparative standstill, with Fury obviously injured and Wrath taking a knee from exhaustion. An impressive feat considering that Fury at the time was a little anger machine. At this point, the two of them were about even, and because Fury is the player, we'd argue things were at least slightly in her favor. However, in her attempt to turn the tide, Fury discovered that her steed, Rampage, had been slain, and Wrath uses this opening created by her dismay to impale her. In response, however, Fury stabs the blade that she'd been impaled with into Wrath's face, seemingly killing him, but also leaving her to bleed out. Double KO, and at best a stalemate. One created by forces outside of Wrath's command or control. This is why, in our opinion, Sloth did better against Fury than Wrath did. Based upon these scenes, Fury would probably have prevailed against Wrath eventually. The only thing he had going for him was his ability to feed off of Fury's admittedly deep reservoirs of rage. Conversely, when the two fought much later, after Wrath regenerated his body, they did so in the midst of a great arena, where Wrath had also lured scores of angels and demons, stoking the flames of their hatred and anger so greatly that they murdered each other with reckless abandon as Wrath watched and swatted at them. Happy as can be. By this point in the game, Fury had learned to control her, well, Fury, and thus gave Wrath nothing to feed on, forcing him to engage the other combatants to heal himself. But it wasn't enough, and eventually Fury outdamaged Wrath's healing capabilities, breaking his body and sealing his soul within the Talisman of Sin.
Which leads us to Gluttony. As previously mentioned, the sins have the ability to assume different shapes, and with no one is this made more clear than with Gluttony. While the Talisman of Sin helps Fury hunt down the various sins, she has immediately recognized all but two of them, the first being Envy, who we'll go over later, and the second being Gluttony. Gluttony is encountered once before Fury realizes what he is, and is actually seen a few times before that if you're keeping an eye out for his tentacles. But it's not until the talisman resonates that Fury realizes that the giant monstrosity before her is in fact Gluttony. Because he has assumed the evidently never before seen or used form of a massive kraken-like creature with the addition of an anglerfish-like glowing appendage that is reminiscent of a sort of meat flower that unfolds to reveal the disgusting quasi-humanoid form that Gluttony uses to speak with Fury. Gluttony appears to have similar, though seemingly less refined or powerful powers of illusion to Lust, able to conjure up images for that which his prey most hungers, though by all appearances these illusions can only conjure up visages of pleasing meals, otherwise it seems likely he would have tried to create a more convincing mirage with which to capture Fury. Regardless, Gluttony lures his prey in with the visions of a choice meal, and then, if all goes well, bludgeons and devours those caught in his lure with his anglerfish-like appendage. He is a personification of emptiness. Gluttony is constantly feeding but never satisfied, never full, a fact he openly complains about upon encountering Fury. He also infers that if allowed to continue to feed and try and sate his hunger, he will continue to grow in both size and power. Gluttony can spew some kind of slime that is both damaging and slows his foes, as well as vacuum suck targets into his mouth to be devoured, a tactic which ultimately proves to be his undoing, when Fury guides bombs into his mouth while he wantonly tries to suck her up, causing them to explode inside his body, weakening him such that he could be captured.
Next, let's talk about Pride. Pride takes the form of an angelic-looking being, covered in incredibly fancy armor, with glowing wings and a cracked crown hovering over her masked face. Though beautiful, she seems to wear the mask to cover up an injury which has left one side of her face scarred and left one of her eyes lidless and exposed. Considering the shape-shifting nature of the 7 deadly sins, it seems likely that either such a marring of her appearance applies to any form that Pride takes, or, just as likely, that Pride is too proud of her own appearance, scarring notwithstanding, to assume a new unblemished form. Many incarnations of Pride are depicted as being creatures with easily bruised egos, led to their downfall by enemies pricking their fragile pride. Not so with Darksiders' Pride. When first encountered, she will inform Fury that the horseman is not worth her time, considering Fury, like nearly everything else, to be beneath her notice. Indeed, when Fury tries the tried-and-true tactic of pricking Pride's pride, the sin brushes off her attempt as beneath Pride's notice, proclaiming that only if Fury proves herself capable of defeating the other sins will she have proven herself worthy of an audience with Pride herself. Which, as a side note, was a wonderful design choice, forcing the final boss fight to be with Pride in a game where many of the sins can be fought in any order. Forcing Pride to go last allows for freedom of the early bosses, while still letting important narrative moments happen during the confrontation with Pride.
When Fury does finally confront Pride, Pride begins by, seemingly genuinely, praising Fury's growth, power, and skill, and then appeals to Fury's pride by offering up a partnership. The two of them against their mutual enemies, establishing order and balance like Fury's masters, the Charred Council, were supposed to be doing, but were not. The irony here is that if Pride had made this pitch to Fury when they first met earlier in the game, it might have actually worked. But by this point, Fury had grown as a person, not just in power, and had been sufficiently humbled to realize that such a partnership was not a good idea. In combat, Pride can conjure up a powerful shield that must be destroyed before she can be harmed. She appears to be a skilled swordswoman, can wreathe her blade in destructive energies, and can fire a variety of projectiles formed from the same energy, as well as animate a statue head and cause it to fire continuous beams of energy to which she herself is immune, which is always nice. Upon her defeat, Fury begins questioning Pride about the nature of the Council's betrayal, something Fury had been given hints about throughout the game, some of those hints coming from Pride herself. Which is when Envy revealed herself. As it turned out, Envy had spent Fury's entire quest at her side, in the trusted guise of a watcher of the Charred Council, offering advice, observations, and even helping Fury out from time to time. This came as a surprise to many, however, because the very first boss that Fury encounters and defeats is a vulture-like creature that looks like something out of the Dark Crystal movie, and that Fury had been certain was Envy. It is from this fake Envy that Fury acquired the Talisman of Sin, the prison which Fury had been using to capture the rest of the 7 deadly sins. One thing that was never explained in-game was, if Envy had been the Watcher the whole time, she was, then who or what was the fake Envy at the beginning of the game? After much research, we think we have an answer. All around the internet we found references to what the fake Envy might be, and the most commonly accepted answers have even had people referencing comments by developers as the source of this information. We could not find these developer conversations anywhere, interviews, Reddit, Twitter, nothing. But, considering the prevalence of this information, and having no better answers, we're presenting it here. Just take this possibility with a grain of salt unless someone can find concrete confirmation.
As far as we can tell, the fake Envy was in fact a sort of wannabe sin or sin groupie that idolized the 7 deadly sins enough that it followed them around, trying to be like them. Even at some point acquiring Envy's Talisman of Sin, yes, that talisman did in fact originally belong to Envy, and using it to siphon off bits of their energy to gain power and become even more sin-like. There are actually two allusions to this first envy being a fake when it is encountered. First, it never calls itself envy, but never corrects fury when addressed as such. Why would it? It wants to be one of the 7 deadly sins. Second, every sin that is absorbed into the talisman generates a bright green glow. Every sin except for the fake envy. When the fake envy is absorbed, the energy is a much lighter green, almost white, which is presumably what non-sin souls may look like, as evidenced by Fury's soul being a similar white when Envy uses the amulet to torture her near the end of the game.
It's worth noting that the Talisman of Sin wasn't just ignoring Envy the entire game. The talisman is supposed to glow as an indication of nearby sins. We see it multiple times throughout the game when the glow gets brighter in the presence of one of the sins. Notice, though, the talisman glows brighter. Why? Because there are now 2 sins nearby, Envy and whoever else Fury is dealing with. Throughout the game, the talisman is always glowing because Envy is always nearby. Fury simply doesn't notice because she's never been around the talisman without Envy also being nearby. We know it works this way, 1, because Fury and the Watcher tell us, but 2, because when we first see the fake Envy, it is looking down on Fury and the Watcher from above, and the talisman around its neck is not glowing. Yet as soon as it teleports in front of Fury and the Watcher, the talisman glows just like it does for the rest of the game, because it is near a sin. Now yes, the fake envy teleports back up to that same spot, and the talisman is by that point still glowing, but, as we previously noted with Fury's encounter with Gluttony, the talisman is not infallible, and it seems likely that the talisman had sort of locked onto Envy since she was still nearby. Additionally, at the end of the game, when the real Envy is absorbed, the light in the talisman finally goes out, because for the first time since it was acquired, there was no sin nearby for the talisman to detect.
Fast forward to near the end of the game, as Pride lies broken at Fury's feet. Envy finally reveals herself, stealing the Talisman of Sin back from Fury, and absorbing Pride into it. Now fully empowered with the strength of her fellow sins, Envy lets out a big villain monologue, revealing that the Charred Council had let the 7 deadly sins go free in an effort to kill all of them as well as Fury, and then she left Fury for dead. She then headed off to assault the Charred Council directly, taking the form that was sort of an amalgamation of all 4 horsemen. A 4-armed creature wearing a facsimile of Death's mask, War's cloak, Fury's clothing, a giant sword like War, dual pistols like Strife, a scythe like Death. Interestingly, it honestly looked to us as if Envy might have won, except that Fury stepped in and the 2 of them did battle. The true Envy boasted incredible strength and speed, wielding all of her various weapons in tandem, while also conjuring up copies of her absorbed brethren in order to use their various abilities to fight Fury. A ground slam from Wrath, a sweeping sword slice from Pride, and so on. Eventually, though, Fury stood victorious and absorbed Envy into the talisman. Afterward, during Fury's confrontation with the Council, Fury detonated that talisman in order to create an opening for escape. What became of the 7 deadly sins in the aftermath is as yet unknown.
And that's the story of the 7 deadly sins of Darksiders 3. In our opinion, some of the best put together representations of the sins we've ever seen. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave us a like, and maybe share it with a friend who might like it. If you have ideas for videos you'd like to see us do in the future, do like all of these wonderful people, and let us know in the comments down below. If you'd like to see more videos from us in the future, be they lore or let's play, go ahead and hit that subscribe button.
In the meantime, this has been True Masters and Morons, signing off. Thanks for watching this video. If you'd like to see more like it, hit that subscribe orb.
To see our last Let's Play, click or tap the link on the right.
For our last lore video, click the link on the left.
Thank you to all of our patrons for making these videos possible.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.